Okay, welcome to this this introduction video where we will talk about coordinate systems in AutoCAD and how you might use those coordinate systems or how they relate to when you're doing your drawing your components, lines, and how you're keying in measurements, angles, etc. So we have sort of three main coordinate systems. We have the absolute coordinates, we have relative coordinates, and we have polar coordinates. And if we think of coordinates, hopefully most people know graph or can relate it to a graph with x and y coordinates. So when you're graphing something, you're using an x coordinate and a y coordinate. It's the same with AutoCAD. We have x and y, and we can use those coordinates to plot or draw our item. So if we head to AutoCAD, again starting at the beginning, or starting with nothing open, we want to start a new drawing. And in our AutoCAD now, with our new drawing, down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see an X and Y. So Y is vertical, pointing up, and X is horizontal. And for AutoCAD, a positive value for X heads to the right, a positive value for Y heads up. Now, with our mouse, we've got a left and right button. Hopefully, you've also got a mouse that has a scroll wheel. And if you scroll the wheel towards yourself, you should hopefully be able to see that X and Y now a bit more into the screen. Green line heading up, red line heading down. Now you could move your mouse over here, you can scroll forward, scroll back. If the mouse is over here, it scrolls into where you are, so the X and Y has now disappeared again. If I scroll back, it brings me back out. Okay. If you have one of those mice, you can also click the wheel like a button, and that allows you to pan or move around the screen. So the reason why I've done that, because I wanted to actually make sure we can see the X and Y on our screen. Now, as we're scrolling backwards and forwards, we're zooming in and out. It can zoom almost infinitely. So sometimes you can get where the screen just looks like a small screen, but it's actually covering a huge amount of area. So again, when you start to draw accurately, sometimes it might be really small and you can't find it. It's because you've zoomed way out. So let's have a go at our absolute coordinates first. Now, the modern versions of AutoCAD, the default setting is to use relative coordinates. And we'll talk about the difference between them a little bit as we go. So an absolute coordinate is relative to the X and Y, which is why I've been talking about that. So X and Y 0, that is an absolute point. And it's an absolute coordinate, or if we're using absolute coordinates, they relate to that X and Y 0. So let's start. In the previous video, if you've seen that, I was using the toolbars to select lines and circles, etc. You can also use keyboard commands to start your tools. So L for line, you can see a list of different options for L comes up. L by itself is line, enter. And it asks us to specify the first point. And that value that's in there on the screen at the moment, 450, 420, that's an absolute value. The closer I get to X and Y, the closer it gets to 0. So that's an absolute value. So if I just type 0 and then use the comma, which again is like mapping and coordinates, 0. So that's X0, Y0, and then hit enter. It has now got a line that is starting from X0, Y0 and coming back to where the mouse was. And it actually says specify the next point. So if I start typing 100 and then comma on the keyboard and then type 0, so 100 on the X, 0 on the Y, enter. It gives me a line that's 100 millimeters long and it's horizontal because it had a Y component of 0. So then my next point, I still want x to be at 100, comma, I want y now to be also at 100, enter. Aha. So you see what it's done there is it's defaulted to a relative coordinate. So it's gone 100 from where I was, which hasn't actually done what I wanted it to do. So let's hit escape to stop drawing a line. I'm going to select that line and delete it. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can now see it. L for line, enter. I'll snap to the end of that. Now I want it to go straight up, but I want to use the coordinates. So to tell it that I am using absolute coordinates, I need to use the pound symbol. So it is Shift 3 on the keyboard. And this time I want it to be at an x of an x of 100 and a y of 100. So, and that's the subtle change in the way AutoCAD is now set up. It's defaulted to the relative coordinate system, whereas I want it to be in the absolute coordinate system. So therefore I need to use the pound key. So pound and now 0 in the x, y, or comma, and 100 in the y. And then I could go back and connect it to there. So it used to be absolute values by default, and you didn't have to put the pound key in or use the pound symbol. And actually, the relative coordinates aren't used as often anymore anyway, which is why it is now set up as defaulted to relative. So if we now then look at a relative coordinate, if I start my line again, enter, and my very first point, I'm going to use absolute coordinates. So instead of starting right at the 0, because I already started there before, I'm going to start at 200 y 0. Okay, so it's 100 away from where I finished the last one. So using relative coordinates now, if I type in 100, comma 0, it has now come along 100 from where I was. Relative means it is relative to where you were. So now I'm at this point down here. So if I want to do a line that goes straight up using my relative coordinates, I'm relative to that point. So x should be 0 and y would be 100. And it's gone straight up. So there was no x component and there was a y. So now if I want to go back this way, again using my relative coordinates or relative to that point where I was, it would be negative 100, comma 0. And I could go back and join onto there. Okay, now you've probably noticed that I've had numbers on the screen the whole time. I've been ignoring them a little bit, and I've been overriding them by using the comma on the keyboard, which overrides those numbers and changes it back to being a relative or absolute value. But I actually don't need to do that anymore either. So if I start a line again, and this time let's start at 400 on the x, 0 on the y. So we'll start here. Now you can actually see I've got some numbers there. So there's a highlighted blue value that's changing, and there's also an angle that's changing. So actually what I can do is come down here, and when it's on this green inferencing line, you can see the angle is 0. So actually I could then just type in 100, and I get a line that's 100 long. If I then come up here and on this green line, 100 again, and so on. So it's actually very quick and easy to draw that box now with the modern tools the way they're laid out. So if we then want to draw the shape using polar coordinates, start again, L, where are we now? We're about 600. comma 0. Okay, so polar coordinates refers to degrees or an angle. So we're rotating around a pole, and again, it's set up to be relative. So if I'm going for an angle, and 0 degrees is this way, so I'll type in 100. And if I then want to define an angle, I use the less than symbol, which is above the comma on the keyboard, so it's easy to remember. And I'll put in an angle of 0 degrees. So now if I want to go up that way, 100 long, the less than symbol, 90 degrees. Again, 100, less than, and 0 is horizontal heading to the right, so 180 degrees will bring us back to there. Again, those polar coordinates we can do without actually using the symbol on the keyboard now. We can just type in, we can see it on the screen, that 100. I can type in 100 and then tab to that angle that's on the screen and hit 0, and we can do it that way. 100, tab, 90, 100, tab, 180, whoops. Okay, so the key thing with drawing with AutoCAD is accuracy. You've got to be in control, you've got to tell it what you want, you've got to feed in the values, you've got to tell it the angles, you've actually got to be in control of what's going on, because it's very difficult to come back later and add the accuracy in. If I just randomly draw a line like this, and then I want to come back and go, oh, I want this to be 100. It's actually quite a mission to accurately turn that back into 100 again. So if you know what you need it to be to begin with, it's much easier. And then I've been drawing these squares using 4 separate lines. There is actually also a rectangle tool. So we have up here rectangle, or we could type in REC. I'll just choose a random point to start with. Again, we're talking about absolute coordinates essentially now, but you can see I'm getting an X and Y component, so I can type in an X of 100, tab, and a Y of 100. And we can draw this rectangle in one tool, and you can see it's actually selected as one item, whereas these are individual lines. Okay, so that's an introduction to the coordinate system and drawing using that coordinate system. The last thing to think about or be aware of when we're talking about drawing lines and making sure that they're horizontal and vertical is we have a thing down here called ortho mode. And what ortho mode does is it makes sure that your lines are either horizontal. See, when I move the mouse, it's staying horizontal. If I come all the way up here, it'll stay vertical. So again, I can then type in 100, and then it's automatically vertical, 100 again. So that ortho mode is very, very useful to make sure when you are drawing lines that have to be horizontal or vertical and need to be accurate, you don't have to rely on that green inferencing line. You can make sure that it snaps to that. Beside that, there's also polar tracking. And so the polar tracking, you can make it stick to certain angles. So now you see it snaps to 30, snaps to 60. So that's also quite useful if you're wanting to draw things at set angles. Okay, thanks for watching. Hopefully you've got something out of it. We'll see you next time.